Hey everyone, welcome to the next edition of Chalk Talk, hosted by the NYU Tisch Institute for Global Sport. My name is Dr. Bri Newland, and I'm the academic director for the undergraduate program. I'm joined today by my great friend and fellow researcher, Dr. Tommy Aicher, who is based out of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs. Tommy and I have researched participation sport for nearly 8 years and have published a number of articles on sport event tourism, as well as 2 books in sport event management. I am super excited to talk with Tommy today. So Tommy, welcome and thanks for joining me.
Hey, Bri, thanks for having me. It's really great to see you and talk to you about this, our industry that we both participate in, and I'm really thankful to both you and the Tisch Institute for the opportunity.
Great, so let's get right into it. So our topic that we are discussing today is the impact of COVID-19 on the participation sports sector. We've seen and heard a lot of commentary on how the spectator sport will rebound from the virus, but we wanted to discuss what, in our opinion, is far more interesting than sport leagues, participation sport. So we wanted to talk about how marathons, triathlons, cycling type events, how are they going to rebound? So Tommy, to start us off, why don't you share a bit about your research pre-COVID and what the industry is like since 2019?
Right. Yeah, no, this has been great. Like many industries up until this current year, the industry was growing tremendously. We saw more and more participation across the board. We saw more and more events start up across the board. So participation's really, really been booming in all 3 sectors, be it running, cycling, or triathlon events. In terms of our research, we've really concentrated on consumer behaviors of these athletes, as well as the impact of the events within the host community. So we're really trying to understand, why do people select to go to certain places or participate in the various events, and then how the events can really leverage their athletes in terms of tourism to really boost that local economy or boost the social morale and things like that. So we've really done a great job of understanding how destination marketing organizations and the events can attract individuals to their events, and then how they can actually improve their local community based on that. One of the best studies I think we've done is really segmenting out runners, cyclists, and triathletes to really understand why they choose certain destinations and what they do in those destinations. That way the destination marketing organizations can really highlight certain activities to increase the amount of people who come to the event, as well as how much stuff they do while they're there. And that way we're really benefiting both the destination community and the event participants themselves.
Yeah, and since, both of us are, I'm a triathlete and you're a runner, and so, it's not only is it fun to do this type of research, but we were drawn to it because we started looking around at what people were doing and what events we were doing and why we were choosing those events. So it was really exciting for us to do this type of work. So, but what's really kind of curious to me, or what I'm interested in seeing, is what is going to happen now that we've gone through this COVID scare. I know that there's been a lot of mixed bag responses from event organizers. So what are some of the things you've heard in the race with talking to the race directors you've reached out to?
This was one of the questions I had. I was registered for 2 different marathons in May, and one canceled completely and refunded me my money. The other one just delayed until a date to be determined in the fall, and haven't even announced a date yet. So I started reaching out to various race directors that we've worked with in the past, or I have a good working relationship with now, to get an understanding of why are they doing this. And a lot of it sadly has to do with insurance and finances. If they had the right insurance to deal with completely shutting down the event, providing reimbursements to all of their sponsors and all of their participants, and still paying for the permits and all the things that they pay up for up front, then they can just completely cancel and it wouldn't matter. So this really led to this decision of, do we delay? Do we cancel? Do we do a virtual race? How can we engage both our participants and our sponsors if we can't cancel because we have the wrong kind of insurance? And honestly, not many had that insurance to where they could just completely cancel outright. So what they were really trying to figure out is, okay, we want to keep our runners happy. We want to keep our sponsors happy. What's our best alternative? Several events that are spring-based events moved to the fall. Some just canceled completely outright. Some of the organizations I talked to, they actually have a series of events. So they gave people reimbursements or credits for later events. And the credits for later events was a really interesting strategy, because ultimately what they're saying is we want to keep that financial stability right now by not giving back people money. And they know that in the future, they're going to have roughly the same amount of participation. So they're kind of spreading that financial loss over time. And I've seen anywhere from next year's race to 3 years from now races. And some of that is actually based off of the various organizations that assist with timing. They said that one race director in particular told me that the timing company had an event a couple years back that was lost to a natural disaster. And the response was, reimbursement for next year. And a lot of people were really upset because they didn't want to turn around and go back the following year. So they really figured out the sweet spot is with these different events is about 2 to 3 years of time for that delay. So if you think about that initial loss, it's not a bad idea to do it that way, because they still have to pay for permits. They still have to pay for all the merchandise and stuff they've already bought. So this allows them some financial stability in the short term and kind of spreading out that loss over time.
Yeah, and the interesting thing for me is, I know in talking to athletes, they're really frustrated because they're like, why can't they just postpone or reschedule it? And I don't think that they understand or have taken into consideration all of the things that go into hosting an event. So if you think about a triathlon, for example, and also a crowded event portfolio for a destination, you can't just move it to another weekend later in the year, because there could be something else that's happening in the city at that time. Plus, you have to think about permitting, you have to think about road closures and all of that. And so it's not just as simple as, oh, we'll just move it to a different weekend in the fall, because there's other events that are happening and other things that the city is going through as well. So while I know from an athlete side, it seems like, oh, why don't you just do it on a different weekend? It doesn't work that way. And so there's a lot of behind the scenes maneuvering happening with these event directors as they're negotiating not only for perhaps postponed events, but also what they're competing with other events that have been postponed and are trying to reschedule as well. So, it's not as simple. And
no, it's really not. There was one event organizer that I spoke with who had a fall event that's also a larger and very complementary event to their spring event. So they actually just moved their spring event to their fall event. But some of their participants that normally only do the fall event were really upset because they don't want the large spring event crowds and populations around. They like the small, intimate setting that the fall event normally is. And that same organization has a really good working relationship with other fall events of their same capacity as their spring event. And now all of a sudden, now we're directly competing with you because we're 1 to 2 weeks away from either your event just happened or your event's coming up. And those are some of the decisions that they had to make, but they ultimately decided because of all the permitting and things that they need to do to host the event, it was the best time to do it.
Right. And then also on top of all of that, so we do have like that normal response, like how are we going to postpone, or do we just reschedule and scrap the season? But then the next layer to think about is what do we have to do if there's rules like tiers for how you social distance? Like maybe there's phases, right? So you can phase in events, but you can only host certain number of people because they have to stay apart. And then who gets to be those people? Like if you have, people have registered for the event, and you're giving them space, who is it, first come, first serve, or is it, how would that perhaps work if we have to deal with social distancing?
Right. And how do you pass somebody on course if you can't get within 6 feet of them?
Right, and I actually read a study from, I think it came out of the Netherlands, where they were looking at how far droplets actually spread when you're running or cycling. So like the normal 6 feet or 9 feet that we would be in a normal environment is extended multiple feet beyond that. So it's interesting to see that next layer of how we'll end up dealing with that. And have you talked to any race directors who are starting to wrap their head around racing and social distancing?
One of them I did we mostly had a joking conversation about it. So they have roughly 20 to 25,000 runners on race day. And he said, could you imagine if we had a starting corral where everybody was 6 feet apart? It'd be about 15 to 20 miles of people just to maintain that social distance. And, that is something to think about. I know that they were talking about, even after post-pandemic, do you really stuff 1,500 to 2,000 people in a 100-foot by 20-foot corral? Or are people going to want additional space or expect additional space? And what does that do to their starting lines? And what does that do to their finishing areas and things like that, where people tend to congregate and get forced into tight spaces? One of the things that he talked about, because they had a half and full, is normally they just kind of mix those people together, but instead of everybody starting at the start time, start the full, and then an hour later start the half. So at least it lessens the need for a long starting area and allows them to actually kind of still maintain less people, so there can be some more social distancing.
Yeah, that'll be interesting, especially as we hear from the CDC and other doctor officials who are giving us this information, how we phase it in and how it affects events is really going to be a whole nother level that I don't think even athletes have really thought about. I know a lot of people from, in my athlete space, they're just super excited to get back out there. They're all having a really hard time, staying at home, doing workouts close to home, or, a lot of them do sneak out and run. And they want to race, but, thinking about what that means to get back out in crowds, I'm sure they'll have a lot of second guessing on whether or not they want to do that event or not.
Yeah, and I know that, races through June and even early July are already canceling, and I have friends too, just runners as well, and we're all kind of trying to figure out, how do we stay motivated? How do we keep training? How do we keep running? When we do go run, do we wear masks? Or do we just like for instance, when I run, I have a balaclava, and as I get close to somebody, I pull it up, and then when I get past them or they pass me going the opposite way, I wait probably 15 seconds and I pull it down again, and that way I can breathe better. But there's different strategies to running and riding these days, for sure. My friends of mine and I were supposed to run one of those events in May, and we've decided to run our own marathon. So it's just the three of us, and we run 6 to 8 feet apart pretty much the whole time, and we're just going to run a marathon. So because we have that unofficial event, we're still running the distances that we plan to run, and we're allowed to, according to where I am in Colorado, we're still allowed to go out and physically exercise. We still have to practice social distancing while we do, but we're allowed to do it. If they took that away, that would really affect a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, for sure. But that also brings me to my next question, because what we've seen event organizers do is really respond in the virtual space. I know, for example, I was looking up on the Ironman website because I'm supposed to race at the end of August, and they haven't announced anything about my race yet. But what I did notice all of a sudden is they launched Ironman Virtual Club, which is where athletes can take on challenges set by the Ironman U coaches, and also any challenges by the greater community. And athletes just record their workouts using apps like Strava or Garmin Connect, and they can upload for different competitions and prizes, and that's how they're incorporating in their sponsors. And so it's really cool. And then another thing is that they're also starting an Ironman VR Pro Challenge with their professional athletes, and so you can watch that on Facebook Watch. And so it's really cool to see the way that they're responding to keep athletes engaged, and give them a challenge of some kind, and then also providing some type of what we're doing is like spectating opportunities, if you will, through our social media outlets.
Nice. That's really cool. I know Running USA has responded pretty heavily in this space, because there's a lot of questions for race directors, how do you manage it? What kind of sponsorship opportunities do you have? How do you truly engage runners? How do you track runners? How do you prevent, race bandits, which baffles me that they would worry about race bandits in a virtual race, because it is totally self-dependent. And it's like, okay, I'm going to run a marathon, but I'm going to cheat at it. It's like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
But there is those issues, right? So Running USA has done a really, really good job of kind of responding to the need to build capacity around this and really learning how do you gauge participants, or what can sponsors do to still get that recognition? Because if you don't have the ASICS finish line, nobody's going to know that it was the ASICS finish line. So how do you still engage ASICS with it? I actually registered for the Flying Pig Marathon's virtual race. And I did it because, one, I've run that event a bunch of times, but two, it was a good way for that one marathon I'm running on my own to count, right? And they actually have it so it's going to be tracked through Runkeeper, which is an app that's owned by ASICS, and ASICS is their title, one of their biggest sponsors. So it's this subtle way of still getting that branding and that messaging out there for virtual races while still engaging me in that space, which has been really, really cool. The one thing that I have seen outside of them is there's this idea that they actually have to control for course running. And I think it started with the Boston Marathon, because when the Boston Marathon canceled, everybody in that region or who had already had plans to travel to Boston, and this was early going, probably around February, everybody started to talk about, well, I'm just going to go run the course no matter what. And so now races are really looking at how do they monitor people running the courses that they were supposed to run, because what they're worried about is if everybody does it, then they'll have the same issue that they would have had they not canceled the race.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. Like, if all these people are out there doing these virtual runs on the course that they were supposed to do the run on in the first place, yeah, it's totally defeating the purpose. I want to go back, though, to your comment about sponsors, because vacation. There's another company called Vacation Races, and they just launched staycation races, where people are basically doing, a stay-at-home race, and their wording around it's really fun, and like they've crossed out words that described their, vacation races as what you would think. You travel to a destination and you do your event there, and it's quite an ordeal. And so now they've changed all their wording to be stay at home and don't see the sights that you would have seen. So it's a really unique way for them to market or promote the event. But one of the things that they're doing is that they've launched a virtual expo. So for those of you who don't know, typically with these endurance events, there's a big expo event where you go and you pick up your race number and your race t-shirt and your number and get everything you need for the race. But then there you can walk through a number of different vendors that are engaging with the event. So you can see not only sponsors, but also vendors that are selling equipment for that event or for that sport. And so they've created this virtual expo that if you've registered for their staycation race, then you can get access to those brands and get discount codes to buy things. So I think it's a really unique way to think about, okay, how are we going to engage our sponsors and keep them involved while we go through this process? And I thought that was a really unique way to do that.
Yeah, the social media influence has been really, really big too, in terms of how various organizations are engaging endurance sport athletes. Like, I follow Brooks because I wear Brooks shoes, shorts, etc. Right? Early this week, they had a Run with a Friend challenge. And what they wanted you to do was FaceTime, or whatever the equivalent is on other devices, but FaceTime with a friend while you're running and take a screenshot of it. So, if I was running with you, Bri, you would have New York in the background and I would have, Colorado mountain scenery in the background. And it makes for a cool kind of dynamic where normally you and I would never run together because you're in, 1,000 miles away. Whereas in this situation, they wanted to see people running, quote unquote, together without running together. And then their most recent challenge was kind of funny. It was the fastest to lace up your shoes or the most creative position to lace up your shoes. And so some of the videos on those have been really, really funny. And that's been really cool to see as well. Saucony's done some similar stuff. Runner's World has produced some at-home strength videos. So Saucony and Runner's World both use some of their own athletes that they sponsor, and the athletes are running, the daily strength program for the day. Some of the endurance athletes, so some of our marathon competitors, are actually doing daily running challenges. So instead of, it's an 8-mile run, a 7-mile run, or whatever, it's more of go run and find an orange object while out there, and then take a picture of it and hashtag it and stuff like that. So that's been really cool to see, where, normally when you just go run, it's just like, I'm going to run. But now it's, you're looking for certain things and kind of engaging with people without actually engaging with people, right? The other thing I've seen a lot of is race ambassadors for different races are getting involved in that space as well. And that goes to this idea of your expo as well. Like, as soon as I signed up for the Flying Peg, I started getting the notifications from race ambassadors about the deal of the day. Fleet Feet is one of their sponsors as well. And they had, the quote unquote deal of the day, which was a discount code to go purchase any product at Fleet Feet. And it was actually driven by the race ambassadors instead of the race itself. So it was kind of a cool way to still be interactive as the race ambassadors normally would.
Yeah, I love the creativity, and I wonder, when we do go back to the way things were, I don't know if we'll ever be normal again, but I just wonder how much will be this innovative thinking, how much they're going to use it now, because we're activating sponsorships in such a unique and different way now, and it's totally engaging and people are really loving it. But I wonder, will they still have that same engagement when we're not all stuck in our homes all the time, So, but I think there's so many cool ideas that have come out of this that could be continued to be used into the future, and just new ways in which to activate sponsorships or engage with vendors or your community. So I think it's a really unique thing that we are seeing so much innovation because we've had no other choice.
Right. And I think that's a good question, because I know that some events will have training code programs or nutrition programs, but they're usually an add-on expense. And right now those are free. So I wonder if it's going to create this expectation from participants that, no, I'm supposed to get my training plan now. I'm supposed to get whatever this thing is now, or discount codes I can use online now. That maybe it does create this new level of sponsorship that may not have occurred before. So it's still allowing the quote free to participants, but the actual event owner can still, cover the expenses associated with that free activity.
Right. I was talking to somebody the other day about gamification of things, and I'm wondering, that might be a unique way that you can also incorporate sponsors, is gamifying these challenges in a way. So if you are doing certain things and you're using Saucony shoes in your case, or whatever brand that you Brooks, I guess you said, not Saucony, but and so if you're using that as part of your person, your person dresses up, your little avatar, use all that stuff. I'm wondering if there's a way that not only can you incorporate these challenges and the use of this equipment and or brand to do that, but then also this more virtual gaming that you could do within it and incorporate your sponsors that way.
Yeah, that would be kind of a neat idea for sure.
So I know we don't have any crystal balls, and it's really hard to predict the future. But what do you think is going to happen going forward? We've talked about some ideas here with innovation and whatnot with activation and sponsorships, but what do you see?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we're professors, so we're taught to teach the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we should be able to do this. It's interesting. The things that I have read, Runner's World or Running USA is predicting the third running boom. So we saw a boom in the late 90s through the early 2000s, and it's kind of tapered off a little bit in the past 5 years. But I'll say this, when I go out and I run in some of the areas where normally I see 1 to 2 different runners, I'm seeing 10 to 15 runners, and it's not peak time. I'm doing everything that I'm supposed to do to avoid people, and I'm seeing more and more people get out there and run. So I actually feel like if we are stuck in this situation long enough and people are really forced to engage in running or cycling or whatever activity it is, instead of the norm going to the gym or not working out at all, right? Because part of the reason why people are getting involved in exercise right now is the only thing they can do outside. And so I do think that there will be an increase in activity over the next several years, because I think people will get beyond that hump that, running sucks, I hate running, right? Because if you run long enough, you learn to love it. Or if you ride a bike long enough, you learn to love to ride or swim or whatever the case may be. So I think we will see some increases. I think next year, 2021 year, will be very, very interesting. I think we'll lose a lot of events. I think a ton of events won't actually make it through this. But it will, that gap will be filled by those really strong organizations that have a whole portfolio of events to where they can sustain through this, the pain that they're receiving right now. So we may see more of a kind of like the big companies start to take over the event industry, or at least the bigger events start to take over the event industry even more.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I read an article by, his name is escaping me at the moment, but he owns the Spartan Race, and they just, like right before all this happened, they bought Tough Mudder. And so in this article, he was talking about like all these people that he's had to furlough, and and he's really condensed his staff down, but they're thinking about like, what am I going to do with these global events? I mean, that's a global brand that has events all over the world. And I think you're right. I think we might see a shrinking of a number of events across the globe, because right now, I mean, there are so many events that you can do globally. And so perhaps we'll see that shrink a bit. And like you said, a loss of maybe some of the smaller events. But, hopefully, because there's still an interest, right? I know you and I aren't going to stop competing. We might be held up for a bit, but neither of us are planning that we won't compete in the future. So there's going to be the demand, and I think you're right. I think we'll see at least a blip for some period of time while all these people are out, because I've seen the same thing when I'm out. Like, people who are there's more people running, and it's because, what else are you going to do right now besides some yoga and body weight workouts? So it'll be really interesting to see, will people just run back to their gyms, or now that they've got a decent running base, will they maybe try a 5K or a 10K, or maybe get into triathlon? So it'll be really interesting to see how that movement will happen. But I like your prediction, definitely, that we'll see a trend upward with these events.
Yeah, I think the challenge that I see, at least in some markets, is that the running group, for instance, is so strong in certain markets. And that's one of those types of organizations that has been decimated because of this, because we can't run together. We can't organize those types of things. But I think I do believe that the more people who get involved with running and they see, oh my gosh, I can run 2 miles now that I could barely run down my driveway that's 20 feet, right? And now they're seeing, I can run 2 miles. Maybe I'll do a 5K. And one of the questions we've always asked, going all the way back to the beginning about research, one of the questions we've always tried to answer too is, how do we get people who run 5Ks to start running half marathons? And how do we advance those half marathon runners to marathons or even further? And what is that psyche and those behaviors that really transition people from one level to another level, or where they run a marathon or a 5K a month or whatever it is, right? So I think that could actually happen with people getting used to the various activities that they didn't do before.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I'd like to thank you, Tommy, for joining me today to discuss the impact on participation sport. It's really great to have these types of discussions. Like, you and I, we don't get to really talk about our research much, and it's really kind of fun to talk about the industry and really see where it might be headed now that we're faced with these very different circumstances. So I'm so glad to have you.
I really appreciate that. I mean, I really enjoyed when you first contacted me about this conversation, just reaching out to some of our past partners and talking to them, talking to some of my friends about, their experiences with running, and really hopefully sharing their ideas today.
Yep, it was wonderful. Thanks, Tommy.
See ya.